If you will, turn your Bibles to Matthew chapter 6. Matthew chapter 6. And the title of our lesson here today is Making the Right Investments. Making the Right Investments. And if you came here today thinking that I was going to give you financial advice, you are incorrect. I'm not the person to do that for you. But we want to think about a different kind of investment, a kind of investment that's mentioned to us in the 6th chapter of Matthew. In Matthew 6, Jesus introduces two areas in which we can lay up our treasures. And he says in Matthew 6, verses 19 through 21, he says, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." There are a few principles in this short section of verses which I believe are foundational, which I believe are transformational to the sustainment and to the development of our faith. And today, I'd like to think for a while with you on a spiritual level about making the right investments. And I want you to consider four things with me today. I want you to consider, first of all, from this text, that this text teaches us that we choose the nature of our investments. We choose the nature of our investments. Notice there's two categories here. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. We aren't talking today about what house you should buy. We're not talking about what car you should purchase. We're not talking about which stock you should invest in today. We have a choice as to whether we will invest our lives into earthly or into spiritual things. You can lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, things as big as houses and lands, or that might be something as small as trophies and coins. You can invest in earthly things, or you can lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. And God gives you the free will to make a choice to pursue in your life the material things of life or the spiritual things of life. And so when we talk about earthly things, we're talking about the highs that some people live for, whether it be through drugs and through addictions or through even sexuality. We're talking about the physical things. We're talking about trophies, living for sports. There's an interesting contrast that's made by Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. He makes a similar contrast to what we see Jesus making here in verse 24. He says, "Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize?" He says, "Run in such a way that you may obtain it. Everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things, and they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown." All right, perishable, imperishable. You can live for perishable things. You can live for things like crowns and medals and gold and jewelry. You can live for perishable things, or he says you can live for imperishable things, but we're going to live for imperishable things. We are going to run so that we're not disqualified from our heavenly race. He gives them a choice, and he says this is what we're living for as apostles of Jesus Christ. And it's the choice that we each have. It's the choice that we must make every day. Are we going to live today for the material, or are we going to live for the spiritual? You choose the nature of your investments in this life. But a second thing we learn from this passage is that investments require sacrifice and they require self-control. If you will lay up a treasure in one specific area, then you're probably going to have to sacrifice something to do it. Notice the phrase lay up. The idea is you're sacrificing something so that you can put some energy aside towards one specific goal. If I choose to invest, for example, in funding my retirement, I may have to choose not to take an expensive vacation to do so. I might have to say, I can't afford that. My long-term retirement's more important. I've got to lay up for this, which means I have to sacrifice that. If I choose to buy a new car, well, if I could buy a new car, I might have to realize I can't remodel my bathroom this year because that money's going towards car payments. If I'm going to put money towards this, I'm going to have to give up that. And as we look at the text before us, choosing to focus on material things, it may very well lead to a lack of investment in spiritual treasures. That's the danger of being too focused on the earthly things, the material things. If I focus too much on the material, then I've got to give up some things spiritual. And so Matthew chapter 6 and verse 24 says, realize this, you can't serve two masters. What two masters is he talking about? I think he's still continuing this contrast that he's brought out in verses 19 through 21. You can't serve earthly treasures and spiritual things. That's two masters. Realize you can't do it. You can't live for them both at the same time. He says, because you're either going to hate the one and love the other, or you're going to be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. The English Standard Version says money. You can't serve God and money. And so we have a choice to make. And if we're going to choose to invest our lives in spiritual things, then that's going to mean we need to be willing to give up some of our earthly, material, worldly goals. And so I want you to think about this question. When you think about what you're investing your life into, are your life's investments truly worth what you are sacrificing, perhaps spiritually, so that you can be invested? If I'm investing myself fully into work, is it worth the time that I'm sacrificing not to invest in bringing up my children in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord? Is my investment in work worth the time I'm giving up in leading my home? If I'm investing all of my energy into my physical house, cooking, cleaning, remodeling, if I'm investing all of that time, is it worth what I'm missing out on with God's family and God's people? If I'm investing so much in sports, if that's my focus, is practices and games and tournaments and travel, and I'm investing so much in those things, and some of those things are not sinful in and of themselves. I like sports. But if I'm investing so much in sports and band and hobbies, is it worth it if I'm having to sacrifice Bible study and worship and brethren in prayer? When I am giving so much to this and I'm having to give up that, is it worth the investment? If I'm investing my life into my college education or continuing education, is it worth sacrificing my spiritual edification? If I'm investing so much into physical me, my clothes, my nails, my hair, my shoes, am I neglecting to love my less fortunate and needy brethren? Am I spending so much on me that I forget about others? Whatever we invest in, we're having to sacrifice something else to invest in it. Investments require sacrifice and self-control. So what do your life's investments say? What are the greater sacrifices that you are making? Well, how do we choose? Why should we choose to focus on spiritual things? Well, in the world of investment, one of the reasons we choose certain investments is because we want a return out of it. There's got to be something we get out of this. And the worth of an investment, what we learn from this text from Jesus as well, is that the worth of an investment is seen in its return. And so what is the return if I invest in material treasures, in material things? Well, one of the simple things we learn from this text is that when you invest in material things, it's a temporal return. It's not lasting. What's going to happen if you invest in earthly things? Well, it says, things here on earth, moth and rust destroy them. The NIV says vermin. Moth and rust destroy, and thieves can break in and steal. We know that earthly things do not hold their value. But when you invest yourself in heaven, in heavenly things, in spiritual things, he says neither moth nor rust destroys, and thieves cannot break in and steal. And so earthly things are a temporal return on your investment. Clothes get old. If I invest my money in clothes and in shoes, eventually they're going to go out of fashion. All right? You're going to have to buy something else next season. Something else is going to be in style. You're going to have to just keep reinvesting and reinvesting as styles change. And hopefully if you hold on to those clothes long enough, in 20 years, they'll be back in style again. But eventually they get old. They get outdated. Your cars rust. So you invest in cars, they're going to rust, they're going to wear down, they get old. And eventually they have to be replaced. Grain molds. So if you invest your life into crops, grain molds. The grain gets eaten by mice. You invest your life into your home and your property. Thieves can loot, they can pillage, they can steal. Everything you've built up for years can be gone like that. Earthly treasures have no real lasting guarantee. We hear the phrase sometimes, you can't take it with you. U-Hauls do not follow hearses, and there are no pockets in a shroud. You're not going to take anything that you've built up here on earth with you to eternity. And so Jesus asks us to consider, here's why investing in heaven is a better investment for you. It lasts. It's eternal. What's the return if we invest in heavenly treasures? He says, moth and rust can't destroy it. Thieves can't break in and steal it. And so with that in mind, when you realize the return on investment, what should the bulk of our life's focus be? Should it be on material things, or should it be on the spiritual? I heard this illustrated one time in a way that I think helps really send the message home. But I think it's very difficult for us to fathom and to contemplate what eternity means. How long is eternity? And so I want you to imagine that we have a rope, okay? Just a white rope. And imagine I've just got a little bucket of paint right here. And I'm going to take this rope and I'm going to dip the very end of it, just the tip of it, in the bucket of paint. And I'm going to take this rope, and this rope is so long that I can wrap it around this entire building. In fact, I can wrap it around this room so many times that you can't even see the walls anymore. The walls are just covered with this rope. And this rope just not only covers this walls, but it continues out the door and in a way that you can't even see the end of it. Do you know what the tip of that rope that's dipped in paint is? That's your earthly life. Do you know what the rest of it is? That's eternity. That's the time that you can spend in heaven. And so many of us are living our lives for just that little tiny short time, which is only a fraction, a small fraction compared to eternity. Are you living for the spiritual, or are you living for the material, the physical, the things that will last? This is important. This is important. Well, here's what I really, really want to get to, though. And that's our last point. We're going to take the most time on this. And that is, one thing that I've certainly noticed, maybe you've noticed, is it seems like it's so hard to get people interested in the gospel, even though it offers them an eternal return on investment. Even though this is something that leads to heavenly reward, even though this is the contrast between the temporal and the everlasting, it seems so difficult to get some people interested. It's concerning. We live in a culture where it seems like there's some that aren't interested in the gospel. So why is this the case? Why is it that some people aren't interested in Jesus and aren't interested when we talk about eternal life and when we talk about heavenly things and we talk about spiritual blessings? And perhaps one of the reasons why is the hearts of many One of the things we see is the hearts of many don't treasure God's blessings of the gospel. And perhaps one of the reasons why is because we're living in a world, for one, for people who are outside of the church, who are outside of Christ, they're living in a world that is under the influence of a highly secularized worldview, motivated by the American dream of prosperity. Think about this for a minute. Emphasis from so many parents, so many grandparents, so many people in this world, their emphasis is placed on a life of earthly success and a life of earthly pleasures. We raise our kids, and in our worldview, we tell them that if you're going to be successful in life, you've got to have money. You've got to have a nice house. You've got to have a nice car. You need to be in political power. You've got to have all these things if you want to have success here in life. And to get that money, here's what you need, kids. To get that money, to get that car, to get that home, to have that property, to live the American dream, you have to have college education, you have to have good grades, you've got to be socially promoted by the people around you. And so when that becomes our focus for our children, it becomes our life's focus, our motivation for living. The spiritual becomes very unimportant in our hearts because the supreme sign of a successful life that we're teaching to others is climbing the corporate ladder. It's drinking to the fullest of all the joys that this earth can offer. And so it's no surprise when our philosophy becomes eat, drink, and be merry because tomorrow we die. From the worldview of Jesus, you can acquire all of those earthly successes, and you can still be considered, in spiritual terms, a fool and a failure. The rich fool in Luke chapter 12, he asks an interesting question. Jesus speaks of him there in the 12th chapter of Luke. And he says, the ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully. Wow, that's the American dream. I guess it's the Palestinian dream at this point, but the ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully. He thought within himself, saying, what shall I do since I have no room to store my crops? Wow, wouldn't that be a nice problem to have? I got so many cars, I don't have enough garages for them, right? I got so much money, I got to have multiple bank accounts for all the money. I got so many crops, I need to build more barns. That's a dream come true for a lot of people. And so he says, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to pull down my barns. I'm going to build greater. I'm going to store all my crops. He's obviously got the money to do it. So he's got the money to rebuild and to build bigger. And I'm going to say to my soul, soul, you have many goods, laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. And God says to him, fool, this night your soul will be required of you. And then whose will those things be which you have provided? You spend all your life building bigger barns, making more money, growing more crops. And he says, you're going to die tonight. And who's going to get all that? And Jesus says, so is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. Do you see the contrast? Here's a man who's laying up for himself earthly treasures. And Jesus says, shame on him for not thinking about the eternal, for not thinking about the spiritual. Following our own wants and our own will without following Jesus can still make us a fool when we don't consider eternity. You know, following Jesus is no guarantee of earthly success. We aren't promised that if we follow Jesus. If you look at Luke chapter 9, verses 57 and 58, a couple of passages here. Someone says to Jesus as he's traveling, Lord, I will follow you wherever you go. And Jesus says, foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. I don't even have anywhere to sleep. At least a fox has a hole, at least a bird has a nest. I don't have anywhere to sleep. It's not always the life that you dream it to be here on earth. So be careful of telling me that you want to follow me wherever I call you to follow me. Because a spiritual life could be a life of sacrifice. It could be a life of earthly struggle and struggles. In Matthew chapter 10, we're told that as family members, we may even have to stand against our own family sometimes in order to stand for Jesus Christ. It might even bring a sort of division to our own homes, Matthew 10 says. It may lead to earthly struggles. The life of the apostles, it wasn't one of earthly pleasures. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 4. In 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 9 through 13, notice what Paul says in this passage of his life being a follower of Christ. He says, I think that God has displayed us, the apostles last, as men condemned to death. We have been made a spectacle to the world, both to angels and to men. We are fools for Christ's sake. Paul understood this is what people thought of us for putting Jesus first. This is what people think of us when we don't put earthly treasures and make those important to us. This is what people think of us when we travel around from town to town and we aren't willing to build up homes and build up mansions and palaces and to grow our bank accounts. They think we're fools. This is what people think of us when people throw stones at us and mock us and persecute us. They think you guys are nuts. He says we're fools for Christ's sake. We're weak, but you are strong. You are distinguished, but we are dishonored. In the present hour, he says we hunger, we thirst, we're poorly clothed, we're beaten, we're homeless, we labor, working with our own hands. Why in the world would somebody want to live a life like that? He says we're defamed, verse 13. We entreat, we've been made as the filth of the world, the offscouring of all things until now. Why would somebody want to live a life like that? Because Paul had seen Jesus Christ raised from the dead. And he knew that this life was not all that there was. He was going to invest his life in spiritual, eternal treasures, no matter what it costs, no matter the sacrifice. Because if you've missed heaven, you've missed everything. And so for this reason, the apostles were singularly invested in their work. It's hard to get people who have been taught this worldview that's only focused on the here and now to listen to that. But we have to keep sowing seed. We have to keep planting seeds. But let me tell you what else is also difficult, I find, in some churches today. Because we realize that those outside of Christ may not be interested, but how can we get Christians, people who claim to be or are in the body of Christ, how can we get them more interested in this great work? Why is it that sometimes even Christians seem uninterested in doing the work that needs to be done for the sake of Jesus Christ and his church? And I want to tell you, I think the answer is right here in this Matthew chapter 6 text. It says in verse 21, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Let me tell you what I think is one of the major problems as to why it seems as though people's heart aren't in the work. It's because we haven't invested in it. And let me tell you what I mean by that. You will not be invested, you will not be interested in something unless you are invested in it. Let's illustrate that with some other stuff. At night, have you guys ever gone through this where at night you lay awake at night thinking to yourself, did I lock the back door? Did I close the garage door? Have you ever had a night like that? Did I lock my car doors? This happens to me all the time. And because I'm kind of lazy, sometimes I just lay there all night long thinking, why don't I just get up and check the car door and check the garage door and check the front door and make sure that I did it? I could just quit worrying about it if I do it. Why am I interested in whether or not my car is locked or unlocked and my front door is locked or not locked or my garage door is locked or not locked? Well, here's why. I've invested money in my cars. I've invested money in the tools that are in my garage. I've invested money into the things that are in my house. I love my children and my wife. And so I don't want somebody breaking into my car, breaking into my garage, breaking into my house, because I'm invested in so many things there. And so I worry about whether or not I have protected that investment. Let me tell you something my kids don't do. They don't lay awake at night worried about whether or not I close the garage door. They don't lay awake at night worrying about whether or not I locked the car. They don't lay awake at night worrying about whether the front or back doors are locked. They sleep great. You know why? They haven't invested in those things. Those things don't belong to them. Those things belong to me. And I've invested in them. And so they're not as interested in them. Their heart's really not thinking about those things. They haven't really put much into it. When I was in high school, I thought my parents were evil, and I'm not just, my parents are good people, but I think everybody goes through that period. Let me tell you why I thought my parents were evil. When I was in high school, I turned 16, and my parents said, "Hey, we got you a car. Here's how much you're going to have to pay for it every month." And I thought, well, I got friends driving around cars. Their parents pay for the car. What do you mean I'm going to have to pay for the car every month? I thought that was kind of evil. And then I got to college, and my parents said to me, you're going to have to make sure you work a lot because you're going to pay for your own college. And I thought, that's evil. I have a lot of friends. Their parents pay for their college, and why do I have to pay for my own college? I think that was very nice. I moved into a house that my parents owned. And they said, "Here's how much your rent's going to be every month." And I thought, you own the house. I'm paying for my car, I'm paying for my college. Why do I have to pay rent for the house too? And you know what happens, though, as a result of you paying for those things? You're interested in them. I had friends, their parents paid for their cars, and they wrecked their cars over and over again, drag racing out in the middle of some country road, flipping cars upside down, driving drunk, and the parents just kept buying them new cars. They didn't care about the investment. They weren't invested. Their parents were invested. I had friends that went to college, and they partied their way through college, and they dropped out of college, and they quit college because they weren't paying for their college. They really didn't care about it. You know what? I cared about flunking one single class because I was paying for every single credit hour I was taking. I was invested, and because I was invested, I was interested in it. In that house, I didn't tear up that house. I was paying rent. I was afraid my parents would keep my deposit when I moved out, right? So I'm going to take care of the house. And it's still the same way today. If you own a house, you take care of the house because you protect the investment that you've made. When my kids moved into their rooms in our home in Ohio, I made them paint their own rooms because you know what happens? When you paint your own room, you don't want to tear it up because who's the one that's going to repaint it? Not me. You'll do it. And when you're invested in it, you're going to be interested in it. Think about this on so many levels. And the reason why we are concerned with somebody stealing our identity is because we're invested in our identity, our credit cards. You know, why does a deadbeat dad care less for his kids than a single mom? That can be frustrating. Why does that single mom who's given birth to that child, who's raised that child, who is scraped to take care of that child, why does she care so much more than that dad who left the child? She invested in that child. And she cares about that child. She cares about the future of that child because she is invested in. Because she is invested, her heart is always with that child. The less you invest, the less you will care. When my kids when they come home from school and we're little and they make this little mug for you in art class, not worth anything to anybody else, and you drop that thing or you break the handle off of it, and they see that and they say, oh, that's what I made for you. Why are they heartbroken about that? But they can drop every dish in the rest of the house and could care less. They invested in that mug. And because of that, they care about that mug that they created. Okay, now we understand it on a physical level. I want you to take this down to a spiritual level and understand it. When we don't invest in spiritual things, we will be people who aren't interested in spiritual things. I want you to think about how this works. About three or 4 years ago, I went to Barbados to preach for the first time. Somebody just called me and said, hey, I'm going to Barbados to preach. There's going to be about 4 of us down there. Why don't you come with us? And so, yeah, sure. Why not? Let's go. I didn't know anything about Barbados before that. I didn't know anything about the Christians down there, the churches down there. People might send out reports about the work in Barbados, and it didn't really matter to me. I didn't read it. But if you take 2 weeks out of your year, you get 52 weeks a year, and you take 2 weeks out of your year, and you go somewhere, and you knock on doors, and you eat in people's homes, and you train young preachers, and you preach to lost souls, and you baptize people who become new converts, and then you fly away. Let me tell you something. I am interested in the work that happens there. I've been back a second time. I'm supposed to go back a third time in May, but coronavirus ended that. I want to go back. I want to go check. I'm texting those people. I'm sending messages to those people. We're conversing. They're in my Zoom Bible studies, still trying to learn. When you invest, you get interested. And I know Mac, who's been to Russia. I know Vernon has been to Colombia. When you go there, you suddenly, something magical happens in your heart. When you have invested into it, you get interested in those people. How does this apply to us as Christians? Well, if we will invest more into the spiritual work, I think that's one of the keys into getting people's hearts more on fire for being interested about its results. Invest in your children spiritually. Teach them. Study with them. Pray with them. And you're going to care about their spiritual progress as they get older. Invest in kingdom work financially, and when you start investing in it financially, you're going to care about its results, both here with the local work and however this local work is affecting global works. You invest in hospitality with others, and those people that you have spent time with, they've been in your home and you've been in their home, and you've had conversations and you've learned about their lives and their struggles and the blessings. When you invest in those people, you will naturally continue to be more interested in those people. Your hearts will go with them. Last summer, we had a family from Venezuela who moved to Columbus, where we live. And the mother came first. They were fleeing Venezuela because the situation had become extremely dangerous in that country. They're Christians. And the mother came first, and then her husband and their 2 boys, and literally just kind of land on the doorsteps of the church. And when they lived in Venezuela, they were extremely wealthy during the time of prosperity in Venezuela. Preachers who had come to Venezuela had stayed in their homes. They had shown hospitality to them. They had welcomed them into their homes. And now they were in a situation where they were desperate in need. They were fleeing. By the way, since then, they've claimed political asylum, and now they are legally here. Columbus is a sanctuary city, which is why they came to Columbus. Not trying to get into politics of all that. But they came, we didn't know them at all. Sent out a message, there's a family here who needs somewhere to live until they can get the legal paperwork pushed through and work everything out. Need somewhere to live. Didn't see a lot of takers. This is our first year. We just moved to Columbus. We're broke, by the way, because we bought a fixer-upper house, and so first year was very tough. But we said, hey, we got a basement. We got room. Let them live here. They stayed with us for 2 months. It was kind of stressful. They got 2 teenage boys, and we got 3 teenage kids almost. But it was an absolute blessing for us and a blessing for them. We learned about the struggles of people from that country. We learned about how good these people were. They didn't want to put us out every night. They would work all day long, and they would not let us in the kitchen. So we're making dinner. We're cooking for you. And we shared dinner with Google Translate every single night, having conversations. They spoke Spanish and Italian, and we're English speakers, and we got to know each other. You know what? Now we have a bond that will never leave us. Why? Because when you invest in people and they invest in you, your heart will always be with them. You invest in teaching kids Bible classes, and you will be interested in how have those kids turned out when they graduated high school, when they graduated college. Who are they married to now? Where are they worshiping now? When you invest in people spiritually, you will get interested in them. When you go to somebody and you have coffee who's having marriage problems and you talk about those things and you help them through that, you will continue to check on them and be interested. And your heart will be connected to them. When you go to somebody's house late at night who needs counseling, who's concerned, who's discouraged, who's weak, who's struggling with something, and you have that conversation, and when you pray together, when you invest in them spiritually, your heart will always be connected to those people. If you want to become more interested in what's going on with the church, if you wonder why your heart seems so disinterested, then please start investing in the work, because where your treasure is, where you've invested your treasure, there your heart will be also. The ultimate point is this: invest yourself into spiritual works, and you'll be invested and interested in spiritual things. So I ask you to consider something. We're going to skip over these last 5 points. And I just simply ask you to consider this. Are you invested in God's kingdom work here? Does your heart seem uninterested in the people here, the work here, the future here? And if so, maybe it's because we need to invest more. In what way can you invest in people? What fruits indicate the degree and the proof of your investment? What are you doing on a daily basis to invest in God, to invest in His people, in your brothers and sisters in Christ here and in other places? If you haven't sacrificed to put your treasure with God, your heart's not going to be with Him either. So what sacrifices do you need to make? Let's close with one final passage, Psalm chapter 19, verses 7 through 10. Psalm chapter 19, perhaps you've sung the song that goes along with this psalm. But verse 7 says this: "The law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. The statutes of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes. The fear of the Lord is clean, enduring forever. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether, and more to be desired are they than gold. Yea, than much fine gold, sweeter also than honey and the honeycomb." God's law, God's commands, God's testimony, God's statutes, God's fear, it's more precious than gold, any earthly thing that you could ever enjoy. The blessings that come from having a relationship with God and with His Son, Jesus Christ, who came to earth to die, to save you, that is a more blessed blessing in your life than anything you could ever acquire materially.